Okay, thanks a lot for attending part one of our Fidestic workflow training session. Um, the point of this is basically to get you introduced to the different options available to you in the Fidestic workflow, give you some basic information about how to edit things, how to tell where things are, and kind of keep track of what is happening. We do have other training sessions coming soon that will dive deeper into setting up the workflow and building out one that works for your business. But this is just designed to be sort of a base level course to get you started and help you understand exactly what the workflow is. So, to start, what is the Fidestic workflow? Essentially, the workflow is a tool that you can set up in your Fidestic account that will be used to send your invoices or payments. We do have a workflow that works for both, to individual users that they then have to approve. So that is the key takeaway of this workflow: is everything that is set up in this workflow is going to direct the invoices or payments directly to a user, and that user is going to have to go through and formally approve those invoices before they will move on to the next step. So you can think about it as really assigning a gate that you push an invoice into, and then until somebody takes action on that, it's not going to move forward in the next step of the process. There are a couple of caveats to that, but that's good enough for now to know that this is basically building the engine that decides where your invoices need to go to officially require an approval and review before they can move on to the next step in the process. I will be largely just saying invoice workflow, just to keep things concise in the description here today. But pretty much everything that I'm talking about does apply to the payment workflow as well. So keep that in mind as we go through. So part one is everything sent through this workflow engine, and we'll talk about the rules and how to set that up in a little bit. But the most important thing to know is that it will sit pending in a user's queue until they review it. So part of your job is like an AP manager or somebody that is in charge of accounts payable in Fidestic is to make sure that nothing has been sitting for too long in any individual user's queue. Now, you can view that right from your dashboard right here. I think the table view is more valuable, but basically this is going to show you all of the users that have pending approvals, and it's going to show you how long they've been sitting there. So you can see in my demo world, one's been sitting for 132 days, which is definitely something that you would want to check on if you were in charge of AP for this account. So that's a great way to just get a snapshot to make sure that nothing is totally stuck and that people aren't ignoring things. The second way that you can view that is to go to the Manage Users page, and then you can see on individual users here that this user has one invoice that has a pending approval. And if you click on that, it'll even take you to the actual invoice itself to see what's going on. So that's just a little background. Again, the important thing to know is this determines where invoices are going to be routed. So step one of the process in Fidestic, as you may or may not know, is we need to capture invoices and get them into our system. There are several different methods that those invoices can actually come in. We can do automated capture on them using our OCR system. We can have users enter them directly. But as soon as an invoice is created, as soon as it exists within our system, that is when those invoices are going to be pushed into the workflow. So the first step is the creation of the invoice. The very next step is it's going to be pushed into the workflow, and that workflow is going to decide where that invoice is going to go to get to the necessary approvers. So to actually view this workflow, if you go to your settings menu up here and click on Manage Workflow, you will be taken to the workflow engine page itself. This is where we'll help you build out, or you can manage and build yourself. This is what is going to determine where these invoices are routed within the system. So again, this is after invoices have been created, after we've done some OCR or somebody has entered them. This is exactly where invoices are going to go. Now, something super important on this is down here. It says invoices will be routed to this user if none of the rules apply. Think of this as the catch-all. So if nothing that we build out, if nothing else that is set up in the workflow is routing appropriately, you can assign a user right here, and this is where invoices will go, assuming nothing else applies. So that's a super important thing to know about and set up when you first set up your account. Make sure that you have your default approver set up properly. Now, the way that the workflow works is it is broken up into discrete stages. So we can see in my workflow here, I've got a stage based on a GL segment, in this case segment 1. I've got a stage based on another GL segment 2, and I've got a final stage based on amount. So these are pretty standard sort of things to set up, but this is entirely up to you as a user. So if you're approaching this as an AP person who's inherited something, it's definitely worth looking at what stages you have already. And if you're thinking about building a workflow from the ground up, the thing to think about is we can have any number of these. So I have an add stage function here, and I can add additional GL codes, vendor numbers, PO number, invoice number, different amount fields. I can add anything, and I can add it anywhere in the approval workflow. So in this example, there's only 3 stages. We don't have a hard cap on that. So I've seen workflows with 12 stages. It really just depends on what your use case is. So when you're approaching this, as a starting point, I always say you should just map it out. Draw it out on a piece of paper, see how you want things to flow, see how you want invoices to be routed, and sort of what rules immediately stand out to you. And then once you've got your rough draft, you can come in here and try to orient it in terms of stages. So if you've got like a department manager that's in charge of things and that's your main driving rule, cool. Well, let's think about what segment of your GL relates to department. If you've got that set, that's a great way to do it. So that's sort of the base level of how this operates, right? You can have multiple stages, anything that you want. In terms of reading this workflow as I have it built here and interpreting it, really the key to this workflow is going to be following along with these connected lines. So in stage 1 here, our first rule and only rule in this workflow is that if this segment is equal to 200, so that is 200 in the GL segment, then it's going to be sent to the AP admin. Now, connected to these 2 rules, as we can see the lines that connect to them, are going to be this GL segment 2 rule for 5100 or 6100, and also this amount-based rule of 500 or greater. These are all going to be tied to this individual rule. So unless it's funneled into this section of the workflow itself, none of these other rules are going to apply. So this is definitely sort of getting into the weeds on how this works, but it's very important. Follow along with these lines, and that'll show you how things are connected. So this rule, even though it's in stage 3, is only going to be part of the workflow if it is connected to this original segment 1 rule that we have here. The reason you can see that is the connected line, and the reason that it functions that way is we added this rule on top of this stage. So from here I can add a rule, and I could pick segment 3, and then I could do just like we did where we added a rule based on amount here. Those rules will then be connected. So this top section is all dependent on GL segment 1 equaling 200 before it's going to be routed. So what that functionally means is only invoices coded to 200 in that particular GL segment are going to have anything to do with the rest of these rules. Now, this bottom rule, which is the amount greater than or equal to 1,000, this rule is separate from all of this. So not only does that mean if it's not associated with this rule, it's going to be routed here, it also means if it is associated with the rule, it could be routed here as well. So the way to think about this is, despite it not being connected, this is going to apply to all invoices, whether or not this rule is triggered. So it could be 200, it'll go to 1,000. It could be 300. None of this will apply, but this still applies. And the way that we built this rule is I added this from the start and added it to the end of the workflow here. So essentially I just added it like this, and what that does is add the rule separate from everything else. So it's a long-winded way to explain why these are connected, and we'll definitely get into this more in part 2. But part 1, the key to keep in mind here is follow these connected lines. That's going to guide you to see how things are connected. Now, for most cases, what you're going to need to do is if you need to edit a particular rule, so say this person's no longer in charge of Department 5100, you can come here and edit this rule, and you can simply change it to someone else. Nice and simple to do. You can also change what the equals rule is here. And a point of note is we do support multiple again, we'll get into that in greater detail in a future video, but we do support multiple things there. And beyond this, we also support additional approvers. This will assign an either or type approver to this. So if you want to have 2 people and whoever gets to it first, we do support things like that. And you can edit any rule that you see simply by clicking on the rule that you see and clicking that edit rule. Now, while that is an option and something that you can do and probably will need to do at some point, we also, for almost all cases, if you're doing a one-to-one replacement of one user for another, using this reassign approval workflow tool is generally a better option. So if I click on this, I can decide who I'm replacing. So let's say we're replacing AP with controller. We want to make that for all current approvals. That'll move all their pending invoices, and future approvals will actually update the workflow engine for you automatically, so you don't have to go through and update each individual rule that relates to this AP user. And this does work on a temporary basis too. So if this person is just out for 2 weeks, you can set it accordingly, and then it will go back to the way it was afterwards. So for the vast majority of workflow type changes, this is the better way to handle it, as opposed to actually going into the workflow engine itself, trying to find every instance of somebody and modifying it. So like I mentioned at the top, the payment workflow works in a very similar way. Pretty much all the same rules apply. In this case, I don't have a complicated workflow. I just assign everything to the controller like we saw on the other one. If we needed to add some more complexity, we can add in stages to this, like amount, let's say, and then we can have amount breakdowns for, in the instance where 2 people are required to sign a check. If it's over $10,000, you can just build that rule right into the system. So I can just make this nice and simple. If it's over $10,000, then we need to have our controller sign off on it. So hopefully that intro helps you out in understanding how and why the workflow engine works the way that it does. Again, look for part 2 on this. It will go into a deeper dive on sort of how to construct your workflow, how to think about it. But this should get you to the point where you can at least tell why things got routed the way they were and allow you to make simple modifications to it. And one more note before we conclude on here. There is a way to get to this workflow from the invoice page itself. So if I pull up an invoice that I have here and I'm curious why these rules were applied, that's what this shortcut is for. If you click the rule shortcut, it'll take you to the workflow page and it'll highlight the rule in question here. So if you're ever not sure why an invoice is routed the way that it was, this is a great way to go about it. So if we compare what we have here, we have 200, 5100, and then a controller approver, because that's how we had it set up. 200, 5100, and then as we learned before, since it's a repeat, it was over $500, so it went to this particular user. If this invoice was over $1,000, it would have required a secondary approver as well. But because it does not, that's not what's displayed. So just a quick snapshot to figure out what it is. To find out where you are, click view rule in workflow button. And then based on the tips that I told you previously, where you can follow along with the lines, you should be able to determine why things got routed the way they are. So if you have any questions, as you always know, hop on live chat. We're happy to help out. And best of luck. I hope workflow modifications and designing goes well for you.